The morning sun was already burning hot when Rebecca tied her last bundle to the saddle. She stood next to her horse, a beautiful brown mare named Rosie, and took a deep breath. The air smelled like dust and dry grass. Fort Stockton looked small. Behind her now, just a few wooden buildings in the middle of nowhere. Her husband Tom had left 3 weeks ago to set up their new ranch near the Pecos River. He told her to wait for the next wagon train, but Rebecca was tired of waiting. She missed him terribly, and the loneliness in the fort was eating at her heart every day. Other women there talked about their husbands coming home for dinner, but Tom was 200 miles away. "You sure about this, ma'am?" asked old Pete, the fort's horsekeeper. His weathered face showed worry as he checked Rosie's saddle one more time. "That desert ain't no place for a woman alone. Hell, it ain't no place for anybody alone." Rebecca adjusted her wide-brimmed hat and pulled her gloves tight. She had packed everything she thought she might need. 2 canteens of water, some dried beef, hardtack biscuits, and a bag of oats for Rosie. Her Colt revolver sat heavy on her hip, loaded and ready. She knew how to use it, too. Tom had made sure of that before he left. "I'll be fine, Pete. Tom is expecting me, and I can't wait any longer." She tried to sound more confident than she felt. The truth was, she had never traveled alone through the desert before. But how hard could it be? Just follow the river and head northwest. Tom had drawn her a simple map on a piece of paper. Pete shook his gray head but didn't argue anymore. He had learned that Rebecca was stubborn when she made up her mind about something. "Well, if you're set on going, at least take the long way around. Follow the main trail even if it takes extra days. Don't try any shortcuts through the deep desert." Rebecca nodded, but she had already decided to take the shorter route Tom had marked on the map. It would save her almost 4 days of travel. The longer trail went way south before turning back north, adding nearly 100 extra miles. She figured she could handle 3 days in the desert instead of 6 or 7 on the safer path. She climbed onto Rosie's back and felt the familiar comfort of the saddle beneath her. Rosie was a strong horse, only 6 years old, and had never let her down. They had ridden together for 3 years, through all kinds of weather and terrain. If anyone could get her safely to Tom, it was Rosie. "Take care of yourself out there," Pete called as she rode toward the fort's gate. "And remember, if something don't feel right, you turn back. Pride ain't worth dying for." The first few hours of riding felt wonderful. Rebecca had forgotten how much she loved being on horseback, moving through the open country with nothing but blue sky above. The landscape was rough but beautiful in its own way. Scattered mesquite trees provided small patches of shade, and the ground was covered with hardy desert grass and colorful wildflowers that somehow managed to bloom despite the harsh conditions. Rosie seemed happy too, stepping lively and keeping her ears forward. She was alert but not nervous, which made Rebecca feel more relaxed. They stopped every hour to rest in whatever shade they could find and to give Rosie small drinks of water. Rebecca had learned from Tom that keeping a horse hydrated was more important than worrying about her own thirst. By noon, the heat was getting serious. Rebecca could feel sweat running down her back underneath her heavy cotton dress. She had worn her darkest clothing to protect her skin from the sun, but now she wondered if lighter colors might have been smarter. The temperature had to be over 90 degrees, and it was still climbing. She pulled out Tom's map and studied it again. According to his markings, she should reach a small creek by evening. There would be water there for both her and Rosie, and maybe even some grass for the horse to eat. The thought of cool, fresh water made her realize how thirsty she was getting. Despite drinking carefully from her canteen, the afternoon brought new challenges. The terrain became rockier and harder to navigate. Rosie had to pick her way carefully between large stones and deep gullies carved by flash floods. Several times, Rebecca had to dismount and lead the horse around obstacles that were too dangerous to ride through. The heat was becoming unbearable. Rebecca's lips were starting to feel dry despite regular sips of water. She noticed that Rosie was breathing harder too, even though they were moving slowly. The mare's neck was damp with sweat, and she seemed less eager to move forward than she had been in the morning. Around 3 in the afternoon, they stopped under a lone cottonwood tree that provided blessed shade. Rebecca poured some water into her hat and let Rosie drink while she rested against the tree trunk. The silence of the desert was complete except for the sound of Rosie's breathing and the occasional buzz of an insect. Looking at her map again, Rebecca tried to figure out exactly where they were. The landmarks Tom had drawn were hard to match with what she was seeing. Everything looked similar out here: rocks, scrub brush, and endless rolling hills stretching to the horizon. She was pretty sure they were still on the right path, but doubts were starting to creep into her mind. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Rebecca pushed forward with growing urgency. They needed to reach that creek before dark. Traveling in the desert at night was dangerous, and she had no intention of spending her first night sleeping on the open ground if she could help it. But as the hours passed and the shadows grew longer, there was no sign of any creek. Rebecca checked and double-checked the map, but nothing looked right anymore. The landscape seemed to have changed completely from what Tom had described. Where there should have been a clear valley leading to water, she saw only more dry hills and rocky terrain. When the sun finally set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Rebecca had to admit the truth: they were lost. The creek that was supposed to provide water and shelter for the night was nowhere to be found. She was alone in the middle of the desert with a tired horse and limited supplies. She found a sheltered spot between some large rocks and made camp for the night. Rosie stood with her head hanging low, clearly exhausted from the day's difficult travel. Rebecca gave the horse a small portion of oats and another drink of water, then rationed herself to just a few sips from her own canteen. As she sat on her blanket looking up at the thousands of stars now visible in the clear desert sky, Rebecca felt the first real stab of fear. The temperature was dropping quickly, and she pulled her coat tight around her shoulders. In the distance, she could hear the haunting calls of coyotes beginning their nightly hunt. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and she was already behind schedule with no clear idea of which direction to go. But Rebecca pushed the worry aside and focused on positive thoughts of Tom waiting for her at the ranch. She would figure this out in the morning when she could see clearly again. After all, how lost could she really be? Rebecca woke up shivering as the first light of dawn crept over the desert horizon. The cold had settled deep into her bones during the night, and her muscles ached from sleeping on the hard ground. Rosie stood nearby, her brown coat covered with a thin layer of frost that sparkled in the early morning light. The contrast between the freezing night and what she knew would become blazing heat in just a few hours reminded Rebecca of how unforgiving this land could be. She pulled her coat tighter and walked over to check on her horse. Rosie looked tired, her usual bright eyes now dull with exhaustion from yesterday's difficult journey. "Morning, girl," Rebecca whispered, running her hand along Rosie's neck. The horse nickered softly but didn't lift her head with the usual enthusiasm. That worried Rebecca more than she wanted to admit. Rosie had always been full of energy in the mornings. Ready for whatever adventure the day might bring, Rebecca gave her horse a small handful of oats and watched carefully as Rosie ate. The moray seemed to have less appetite than normal, chewing slowly and without much interest. This was not a good sign. A horse that didn't want to eat was often a horse in trouble. After packing up her simple camp, Rebecca climbed into the saddle and studied Tom's map one more time. In the daylight, she could see landmarks that had been invisible in yesterday's fading light. There was a distinctive rock formation about 2 miles to the north that Tom had marked on the paper. If she was reading the map correctly, the creek should be just beyond those rocks. The morning air was still cool as they began riding, but Rebecca could already feel the sun gaining strength. Within an hour, she had removed her heavy coat and tied it behind her saddle. By the time they reached the rock formation, sweat was beginning to form on her forehead. Despite the early hour, the rocks were even more impressive up close, towering red sandstone pillars that looked like ancient monuments built by giants. Tom had drawn them perfectly on his map, which gave Rebecca hope that she was back on the right track. According to his markings, the creek lay in a valley just past these formations, but when they crested the ridge beyond the rocks, Rebecca's heart sank. Instead of the green valley with flowing water that she had imagined, She found herself looking down into a dry wash filled with nothing but sand and scattered bones. The creek bed was there, exactly where Tom had marked it, but it was completely dry. She rode Rosie down into the wash and dismounted to examine the ground more closely. The sand was hard-packed and cracked, with no sign that water had flowed here in months, maybe years. Scattered around the creek bed were the bleached white bones of various animals that had come here seeking water and found only death. Rebecca's hands shook as she realized what this meant. She had counted on this water source to refill her canteens and give Rosie a good drink. Now she was facing the terrible truth that they would have to continue deeper into the desert. With only the water they carried, she looked at her 2 canteens. One was already half empty, and the other had maybe 3/4 of its water remaining. At their current rate of consumption, she might have enough water for 2 more days if she was very careful. But Rosie needed water too, and a horse required much more than a human could survive on. The sun was climbing higher now, and the temperature was rising fast. Rebecca knew she had to make a decision quickly. She could turn back toward Fort Stockton, but that would mean admitting defeat and facing several days of travel with limited water. Or she could push forward, gambling that they would find water somewhere ahead. Looking at Tom's map again, she saw that he had marked another possible water source about 30 miles to the northwest. It was marked with a question mark, which meant he wasn't sure if it was reliable, but it was their best hope. She decided to take the gamble and continue forward. The 3rd day of travel began badly and got worse. The sun seemed more intense than before, beating down like a hammer on an anvil. By mid-morning, the temperature had already climbed past 100 degrees, and there wasn't a cloud in the sky to offer even a moment's relief. Rosie was struggling now. Rebecca could feel it in the way the horse moved, her normally smooth gait becoming choppy and uncertain. The Murray's breathing was labored, and she stopped frequently to rest even when Rebecca didn't ask her to. Each time they paused, Rebecca gave Rosie a few precious sips of water, watching their supply dwindle with growing panic. Around noon, disaster struck without warning. They were crossing what looked like solid ground when Rosie suddenly stumbled forward, her front leg disappearing into a hidden hole. The sound that followed would haunt Rebecca for the rest of her life, a sharp crack like a dry branch breaking, followed by Rosie's scream of pain. The horse went down hard, throwing Rebecca from the saddle to land roughly in the sand several feet away. For a moment, Rebecca lay stunned, her ears ringing and her vision blurry. When she managed to sit up, she saw Rosie lying on her side, her right front leg bent at an impossible angle. "No, no, no," Rebecca whispered, crawling over to her beloved horse. Rosie's eyes were wide with pain and terror, and she was breathing in quick, shallow gasps. Rebecca had seen enough injured animals on the farm to know that the leg was badly broken. In this wilderness, with no veterinarian and no way to transport a 1,000-pound horse, there was only one merciful option. Rebecca sat beside Rosie's head, stroking the Mare's neck and whispering soothing words even as tears streamed down her face. "I'm so sorry, girl. I'm so sorry I brought you out here. This is all my fault." Rosie seemed to calm slightly at the familiar voice, but Rebecca could see the pain in her dark eyes. With shaking hands, Rebecca pulled Tom's Colt revolver from its holster. The gun felt impossibly heavy as she checked to make sure it was loaded. She had practiced shooting targets back at the ranch, but she had never imagined she would have to use the weapon for something like this. She pressed her face against Rosie's neck one last time, breathing in the familiar scent of horse and leather and dust. "Thank you for everything, my beautiful girl. I'll never forget you." Then she stood up, stepped back a few paces, and did what had to be done. The gunshot echoed across the empty desert like thunder. Birds that had been hidden in nearby bushes took flight in panic, their wings beating frantically against the hot air. Then silence returned, deeper and more complete than before. Rebecca knelt beside Rosie's still form and cried until she had no tears left. When she finally stood up, she felt like a different person than the confident woman who had left Fort Stockton 3 days earlier. Now she was truly alone in the vast desert with nothing but the supplies she could carry on her back. She salvaged what she could from the saddle, her remaining water, some dried food, a blanket, and her small bag of personal belongings. Everything else would have to stay with Rosie, the saddle, the extra clothes, the bag of oats, all useless now. As Rebecca shouldered her pack and began walking northwest toward the uncertain water source on Tom's map, she tried not to think about the impossible distance ahead of her. One step at a time, she told herself. Just keep moving forward, one step at a time. Walking in the desert was nothing like riding. Every step felt like walking through thick mud, even though the ground was hard-packed sand and rock. Rebecca's boots, which had felt comfortable in the saddle, now rubbed against her feet with each stride. Within the first hour of walking, she could feel blisters forming on her heels. The pack on her back, which had seemed light when she first shouldered it, now felt like it weighed 100 pounds. Her water canteen sloshed with each step, reminding her of how precious and limited their contents were. She had already drunk more water this morning than she had planned for the entire day. The sun climbed higher, turning the desert into a furnace. Heat waves rose from the sand, making everything in the distance shimmer like water. Several times, Rebecca caught herself walking toward what looked like a cool lake on the horizon, only to realize it was just her desperate mind playing tricks on her. By midday, she was forced to stop and rest under a small mesquite tree. The shade it provided was barely enough to cover her body, but it was better than nothing. She allowed herself 3 small sips of water and tried not to think about how little remained in her canteens. At this rate, she would be completely out of water by tomorrow evening. The heat under the tree was still unbearable. Rebecca could feel sweat evaporating from her skin almost as fast as her body produced it. Her lips were already starting to crack, and her tongue felt thick in her mouth. She knew these were early signs of what could become a deadly problem. When she tried to continue walking after her rest, Rebecca discovered that her legs had stiffened up. Each step sent sharp pains through her calves and thighs. Her feet felt like they were on fire inside her boots, and she was sure the blisters had gotten much worse. The afternoon stretched on endlessly. Rebecca found herself counting steps to keep her mind occupied. 100 steps, then rest for a minute. Another 100 steps, then another short rest. But even this simple counting became difficult as her head began to feel fuzzy from the heat and dehydration. Around 3 o'clock, she noticed the first vulture. It was just a black speck circling high in the blue sky, but Rebecca knew what it meant. These birds had incredible eyesight and could spot a struggling animal from miles away. They were patient creatures, content to follow and wait for nature to take its course. By 4 o'clock, there were 3 vultures. By 5, she counted 6 of them, wheeling slowly overhead like dark angels of death. Their presence filled Rebecca with a cold dread that seemed to fight against the blazing heat surrounding her. These birds didn't follow healthy, strong creatures. They followed things that were going to die. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Rebecca's condition worsened rapidly. She stumbled frequently now, catching herself on rocks and bush to keep from falling. Her vision was beginning to blur around the edges, and she felt dizzy even when standing still. The water in her canteens was nearly gone. She had been trying to ration it carefully, but her body was demanding more and more to replace what she was losing to the brutal heat. Each sip seemed to disappear immediately, providing only seconds of relief before the thirst returned stronger than before. Night brought some relief from the temperature, but it also brought new problems. Rebecca had pushed herself so hard during the day that when darkness fell, she could barely stand. She found a sheltered spot between some rocks and collapsed onto her blanket, her whole body shaking with exhaustion. The desert night was cold, a sharp contrast to the day's furnace-like heat. Rebecca wrapped herself in her blanket and tried to sleep, but her mind wouldn't stop racing. She kept thinking about Tom, wondering if he was worried about her yet. He wouldn't expect her to arrive for another few days, so he probably wasn't. Even looking for her, the thought of Tom finding out what happened to her was almost worse than her own fear of dying. He would blame himself for drawing the map that led her into this wasteland. He would never forgive himself for not insisting she wait for the wagon train. Sleep came in short, fitful periods broken by strange dreams and the howling of distant coyotes. Rebecca would drift off for a few minutes, then wake up disoriented and afraid, not sure where she was or what had happened to her. Each time she woke up, the vultures were still there, now perched on nearby rocks with their wings folded, waiting. The fourth day dawned gray and hazy, with no wind at all. The air felt thick and hard to breathe, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. Rebecca's water was completely gone now. She had drunk the last few drops during the night, and her canteens lay empty beside her. Getting to her feet required enormous effort. Rebecca's muscles had stiffened during the night, and every movement caused sharp pains to shoot through her body. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, and her tongue felt like leather in her mouth. She tried to walk, but managed only a few hundred yards before she had to stop and rest. The vultures followed overhead, more of them now, their shadows providing the only relief from the climbing sun. Some of them had grown bold enough to land nearby, hopping closer with their ugly heads tilted to study her with cold, patient eyes. Around mid-morning, Rebecca discovered a small barrel cactus growing in the shade of a rock formation. She remembered Tom telling her that these plants stored water in their thick stems. Using a sharp stone, she managed to cut into the cactus and squeeze out a few precious drops of bitter liquid. The cactus juice was terrible, thick and slimy with a taste like medicine, but it was moisture. Rebecca squeezed every drop she could from the plant, ignoring the sharp spines that cut her hands. It wasn't much, maybe a quarter cup of liquid, but it was enough to give her the strength to continue. Walking for a few more hours. By afternoon, Rebecca was no longer walking in a straight line. She wandered from side to side, following whatever path seemed easiest at the moment. Several times she found herself walking in circles, recognizing rocks and bush she had passed before. The heat was playing more tricks on her mind now. She saw Tom standing in the distance, waving at her to come home. She saw her childhood home in Missouri, with her mother hanging laundry on the line. She saw cool streams and shade trees that vanished when she tried to reach them. The vultures were landing closer now, some of them only 20 or 30 feet away. They watched her with their dark, intelligent eyes, their featherless heads turning to follow her movements. Rebecca tried throwing rocks at them, but she was too weak to throw accurately, and the birds simply hopped out of reach and continued watching. As the sun began to set on her fourth day in the desert, Rebecca finally collapsed. She had been stumbling along a dry creek bed when her legs simply gave out beneath her. She fell forward into the sand, too exhausted to even put her hands out to break her fall. She lay there for a long time, listening to her heart pounding in her ears and feeling the heat radiating up from the sand beneath her. The vultures were very close now, some of them walking on the ground nearby like ugly, oversized chickens. Rebecca tried to get up, but couldn't find the strength. Her arms and legs felt like they belonged to someone else, heavy and unresponsive. She managed to roll onto her back and look up at the darkening sky, where more vultures circled in lazy spirals. This was it, she realized. This was where she was going to die, alone in this empty wasteland with only the vultures for company. She closed her eyes and tried to think of Tom, tried to remember his face and the sound of his voice. But even those precious memories seemed to be fading in the heat and exhaustion that clouded her mind. The desert had won. Rebecca drifted in and out of consciousness as the desert night settled around her. Sometimes she thought she was back home in Missouri, helping her mother prepare dinner. Other times she believed she was still riding Rosie through green meadows, where wildflowers bloomed and cool streams bubbled over smooth stones. But then the pain would bring her back to reality, the burning sand beneath her back, the terrible thirst, and the sound of vultures shuffling closer in the darkness. The stars appeared one by one in the clear desert sky, more brilliant than she had ever seen them. Without the lights of towns or cities, the heavens looked like diamonds scattered on black velvet. In her fevered state, Rebecca imagined she could reach up and touch them, that they might be cool against her burning skin. She tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come properly. Her lips were too cracked and swollen to form sounds, and her mind kept wandering to strange places. She thought about all the things she wished she had said to Tom before she left. how much she loved him, how grateful she was for their life together, how sorry she was for being so stubborn and impatient. As the night wore on, Rebecca's breathing became shallow and irregular. Her body was shutting down, conserving what little energy remained for the most essential functions. She could no longer feel her hands or feet, and her vision had narrowed to just a small circle directly above her face. The vultures grew bolder in the darkness. She could hear them moving around her, their claws scratching against rocks and their wings rustling as they repositioned themselves for the inevitable. One of them landed just a few feet from her head, its ugly face tilted as it studied her with one bright, curious eye. Then, somewhere in the distance, Rebecca heard something that didn't belong in the desert night. At first she thought it was just another hallucination, her dying brain creating sounds of hope where none existed. But the sound came again, clearer this time, the rhythmic thunder of horse hooves against hard ground. A rider was approaching, moving fast across the desert floor. Rebecca tried to lift her head to look, but she didn't have the strength. She could only listen as the hoofbeats grew closer and closer, accompanied now by the sound of a horse breathing hard from a long run. The vultures scattered as the rider appeared, their wings beating frantically as they took flight and circled overhead once more. Rebecca heard the horse snort and stamp its feet, then the sound of someone dismounting and walking toward her. Through her blurred vision, she saw a figure kneeling beside her. It was a young man, maybe 25 years old, with long black hair and dark skin weathered by sun and wind. He wore simple leather clothing and moccasins that made no sound on the sand. His horse, a beautiful paint with patches of brown and white, stood nearby with its head lowered, still breathing hard from the long ride. The young man said something in a language Rebecca didn't understand, his voice soft but urgent. She tried to respond, to tell him her name and ask for help, but only a weak croak came from her throat. He leaned closer, studying her face with concerned dark eyes. Rebecca had never seen a Comanche warrior before, but she knew immediately what he was. The story she had heard at Fort Stockton came flooding back, tales of raids and battles, of settlers who had disappeared without a trace in this very desert. Fear cut through her delirium, even though she was too weak to do anything about it, but instead of the violence she expected, the warrior gently placed his hand on her forehead, testing her temperature. He spoke again, this time in broken English, mixed with his own language. "Water," he said clearly, then added something else she couldn't understand. He moved quickly to his horse and returned, with a water skin made from animal hide. Rebecca watched through half-closed eyes as he lifted her head carefully and brought the water to her lips. The first drops felt like heaven against her parched mouth, but he only allowed her a tiny sip before pulling the water away. Rebecca tried to reach for more, desperate for the precious liquid, but the warrior shook his head firmly. He said something that sounded like scolding, but his tone was gentle. She realized he was preventing her from drinking too much too quickly, knowing it could make her sick or even kill her in her weakened state. Over the next hour, he gave her water in tiny amounts, just a few drops at a time. Between each sip, he would wait and watch her carefully, making sure her body could handle what he had given her. It was torture to have water so close and not be able to drink her fill, but Rebecca began to understand that this stranger was saving her life with his patience and knowledge. As her mind cleared slightly with the water, Rebecca studied her rescuer more closely. His name, she learned through gestures and simple words, was something that sounded like White Fox. He was returning from a hunting trip, following a route that had brought him through this remote part of the desert. White Fox examined her condition with the skill of someone who understood survival in harsh places. He checked her pulse, looked at her eyes, and felt her skin to judge how badly dehydrated she was. His face remained serious throughout the examination, and Rebecca could tell her situation was still very dangerous. Using a combination of English words, hand gestures, and simple drawings in the sand, White Fox tried to communicate with her. He pointed to himself and said, "Comanche," then pointed to her and raised his eyebrows in question. Rebecca managed to whisper, "Rebecca," and saw him nod in understanding. When he asked about her horse and supplies through gestures, Rebecca pointed weakly back in the direction she had come from. She made the motion of something falling and breaking, then covered her eyes to show sadness. White Fox seemed to understand that her horse was dead and that she had been walking alone. His expression showed something that looked like respect mixed with concern. Here was a woman who had survived 4 days alone in the desert after losing her horse. Many experienced warriors would not have lasted as long under similar circumstances. As the night progressed, White Fox worked to stabilize her condition. He gave her tiny pieces of something that looked like dried cactus mixed with animal fat. It tasted terrible, but she could feel it giving her body nutrition it desperately needed. He also prepared a paste from ground plants and water, which he applied to her cracked lips and the worst of her sunburned skin. The warrior built a small shelter using his horse blanket and some dead branches, creating shade that would protect her when the sun rose again. He worked quietly and efficiently. Clearly someone who was used to surviving in the wilderness with minimal resources. Rebecca watched him work and felt a confusing mix of emotions. Everything she had been taught about Comanche warriors told her she should be terrified. But this man was risking his own safety and using his precious water and supplies to save the life of a stranger. Not just any stranger, but a white woman whose people had been at war with his tribe for generations. As dawn approached, White Fox made it clear through gestures that they needed to move. He couldn't carry her on his horse for long distances, but there was a place not far from here where they could find better shelter and more water. He showed her with hand signals that it was maybe half a day's ride to the north. Rebecca nodded weakly, understanding that she had no choice but to trust this man completely. Without him, she would certainly die in this desert. With him, she at least had a chance to see Tom again and return to the life they had been building together. White Fox lifted her carefully onto his horse, supporting her weight as she struggled to stay upright in the saddle. Then he swung up behind her, his arms on either side to keep her from falling as they began the journey toward whatever sanctuary he had in mind. As they rode through the pre-dawn darkness, Rebecca felt the strangest sensation of safety she had experienced since leaving Fort Stockton. This warrior, this supposed enemy, had become her protector and guide through the wilderness that had nearly claimed her life. The ride to White Fox's hidden sanctuary felt like a dream to Rebecca. She drifted in and out of consciousness, her body swaying against his steady presence behind her in the saddle. Every few minutes he would offer her tiny sips of water or adjust her position to keep her from sliding off the horse. The sun was climbing higher when they finally reached their destination, a narrow canyon hidden between tall rock walls that Rebecca never would have found on her own. A small spring bubbled up from the rocks at the canyon's base, creating a pool of clear, sweet water surrounded by green grass and even a few small trees. White Fox dismounted first, then carefully helped Rebecca down from the horse. Her legs immediately gave out, and she would have fallen if he hadn't caught her. He guided her to a shaded spot near the spring and helped her lie down on soft grass that felt like the finest bed she had ever known. The sound of flowing water was like music after so many days of desert silence. Rebecca wanted desperately to crawl to the spring and drink until she burst, but White Fox gently held her back. He brought water to her in a small gourd, continuing to limit how much she could drink at one time. Over the next 3 days, White Fox slowly nursed Rebecca back from the edge of death. He had a deep knowledge of desert medicine that amazed her. He made teas from various plants that helped her body recover its strength. He prepared poultices from ground cactus that soothed her sunburned skin and helped her cracked lips heal. Most importantly, he understood exactly how much water and food her damaged body could handle. Too much too fast would have killed her, but White Fox fed her tiny amounts every hour, gradually increasing the portions as her condition improved. He mixed water with plant juices that helped her body absorb the liquid more effectively. Communication between them was a constant challenge, but they found ways to understand each other. White Fox knew more English than he had first revealed, though he spoke it slowly and carefully. Rebecca tried to learn some words in his language, pointing to objects and repeating the sounds he made. On the second day, as Rebecca felt strong enough to sit up for longer periods, White Fox told her his story through a mixture of English words and gestures. He had been hunting alone, tracking a small herd of deer, when he spotted the vultures circling in the distance. His grandfather had taught him that where vultures gathered, there was often someone in need of help. "Grandfather say," White Fox explained in his careful English, "all life sacred, help when can help." He pointed to the sky, then to his heart. "Spirit of all people same inside." Rebecca learned that White Fox was not just any warrior, but the grandson of a respected medicine man in his tribe. He had been trained from childhood in the arts of healing and survival. Finding her in the desert was not just luck. He had deliberately followed the vultures because he knew someone might be in trouble. As her strength returned, Rebecca shared her own story. She told him about Tom, about their ranch, about her impatient decision to travel alone through the desert. White Fox listened carefully, nodding at parts of the story he understood and asking simple questions when he was confused. When she described Rosie's accident and the difficult decision she had been forced to make, White Fox's expression grew solemn. "Horse spirit free now," he said quietly. "You give good death, not suffer." His words brought tears to Rebecca's eyes, but also a kind of peace she hadn't felt since that terrible moment. On the third day, White Fox announced it was time to leave. Rebecca felt much stronger, though still weak compared to her normal condition. He had decided to take her to the nearest settlement, a small trading post about 2 days' ride from the hidden canyon. The journey was slow, but steady. White Fox kept his horse to an easy walk and stopped frequently to rest. He had fashioned a more comfortable saddle arrangement using blankets and rope, making sure Rebecca wouldn't fall even if she dozed off during the ride. During the long hours of travel, they continued to talk and share stories. Rebecca learned about White Fox's family, his 2 younger sisters, and his dream of becoming a medicine man like his grandfather. White Fox learned about Rebecca's life in Missouri before coming to Texas, her fears about starting over in a new place, and her deep love for Tom. What struck Rebecca most was how similar their hopes and dreams were, despite coming from such different worlds. White Fox wanted to help his people stay healthy and safe. Rebecca wanted to build a good life with Tom and maybe raise children who would have better opportunities than she had known. Both of them valued family, hard work, and treating others with respect. On the afternoon of the second day, they crested a hill and saw smoke rising from the chimneys of Millerville, a small trading post that served travelers and ranchers in the area. Rebecca's heart raced as they approached the settlement. She was finally going to see Tom again, but she was also sad that her time with White Fox was coming to an end. As they rode into town, Rebecca could see people staring at them with surprise and concern. A white woman riding double with a Comanche warrior was not something these frontier folks saw every day. Some men reached for their guns, but Rebecca quickly called out that she was all right and that White Fox had saved her life. Tom was at the trading post, frantically organizing a search party with several other ranchers. When he saw Rebecca, he ran toward them with tears streaming down his face. The relief and joy in his eyes made all her suffering worthwhile. White Fox helped Rebecca down from the horse and stepped back as Tom swept her into his arms. For several minutes, Tom could only hold her and whisper her name over and over, unable to believe she was really alive and safe. When Tom finally composed himself enough to speak, he turned to White Fox with an expression of deep gratitude. "Thank you," he said simply, extending his hand. "You saved my wife's life. I can never repay you for that." White Fox shook Tom's hand solemnly. "No need repay, was right thing do." He looked at Rebecca one more time and smiled. Strong woman. Desert. Could not take her. The warrior refused Tom's offers of money or supplies as payment for what he had done. He accepted only enough food and water for his journey home, along with a small bag of coffee beans that he said his grandfather would enjoy. As White Fox prepared to leave, Rebecca approached him one final time. She had been thinking about what to say, how to express what his kindness had meant to her. In the end, she simply took his hand and said, "Thank you for showing me that enemies can become friends." "I will never forget you," White Fox nodded gravely. "Maybe someday all people understand this. No enemies, just people who not know each other yet." The years that followed brought many changes to Texas. Relations between settlers and native American tribes grew more tense as more people moved west. There were conflicts and tragedies on both sides, fueled by fear and misunderstanding, but whenever discussions turned to fighting or violence, Rebecca would tell her story. She spoke at community meetings, to church groups, to anyone who would listen. She described the Comanche warrior who could have left her to die but instead risked his own safety to save her life. Some people dismissed her story or claimed she was naive about the realities of frontier life. But others listened and began to think differently about the native peoples they had always considered enemies. Rebecca's tale spread throughout the region. Carried by travelers and traders who had heard her speak, Rebecca never saw White Fox again, though she often wondered what became of him. But his lesson about the similarity of all human hearts stayed with her forever. In a harsh land where survival often seemed to depend on viewing others as threats, she had learned that compassion could bridge any divide. Her story became a reminder that even in the darkest moments, when death seems certain and hope is lost, salvation can come from the most unexpected places. Sometimes an enemy is just a friend you haven't met yet, and sometimes the person who saves your life is someone you never thought you could trust. The desert had nearly claimed Rebecca's life, but it had also taught her the most important lesson she would ever learn, that human kindness knows no boundaries of race or culture, and that we are all more alike than different under the vast sky that covers us all.